Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So the year is 1689, and King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, the absolute monarch of the most powerful nation in Europe, is entirely out of money.
Right. The state coffers are just running completely dry.
The armies need to be paid, and the financial strain is so acute that Louis actually orders the removal of the solid silver furniture from the grand apartments at the Palace of Versailles.
Which is such a profound image. I mean, we are talking about desks, thrones, balustrades, even these heavy silver chandeliers.
All of it is hauled away,
Yeah.
sent straight to the royal mint and melted down into coins just to keep his war machine moving.
Melting down the artwork of Versailles to pay for muskets and bread, it really sets the tone for this period.
It really does. We are doing a deep dive today into the source material and the conflict that forced the most opulent monarch in history to liquidate his own living room. We are looking at the 9 Years' War.
Right. Spanning 1688 to 1697. And this is really the crucible that forged modern global warfare.
It is a continent-wide struggle.
Exactly. We are looking at a conflict where Louis XIV, in this relentless, almost paranoid pursuit of secure borders, ignites a war against an alliance of powers that felt genuinely threatened by his ambitions.
And as you go through the sources, you realize this is the blueprint for the global power struggles of the 18th century.
Oh, absolutely. It reshapes the balance of power, it cements the consequences of the Glorious Revolution in England, and it fundamentally alters how armies fought.
How they were supplied, how states paid for them.
Yeah, all of it.
So we're going to unpack exactly how a quest for a secure border spirals into this global conflict. Let us establish the board first. The roots of this war trace directly back to the 1678 Treaty of Nijmegen.
Right, which ended the Franco-Dutch War.
And at this point, Louis XIV is at the peak of his prestige. But instead of continuing to launch grand campaigns of conquest, his entire strategic philosophy shifts.
He begins looking at the map of France and deciding he needs better walls.
Right, and he is guided by this trio of extraordinarily capable men.
You have the military engineer, Sébastien Le Pasteur de Vauban, the foreign minister, Colbert de Croissy, and his minister of war, the Marquis de Louvois.
And Vauban, in particular, looks at France's northern and eastern frontiers. And what does he see?
He sees a porous, chaotic mess, just overlapping jurisdictions and vulnerable entry points. So Vauban comes up with the concept of the précaré.
The squared field.
Precisely. He envisioned a dual line of mutually supporting fortresses. He wanted to smooth out the jagged edges of the national border, creating a barrier so formidable that no enemy army could ever march into the French interior without first getting bogged down in years of siege warfare.
But there is a catch here. To build this perfect, smooth line of fortresses, France needs to control specific towns and river crossings that currently belong to other countries.
Right, specifically the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish Netherlands.
And this is where the strategy becomes so insidious. Instead of declaring war and taking the land by force, Colbert de Croissy and Louis decide to weaponize the legal system.
Yeah, this period, leading up to 1684, is known as the War of the Reunions.
So how does this legal weaponization actually work?
Well, the treaties that ended the previous conflicts, such as the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, were drafted with notoriously imprecise language. They would cede a territory to France, along with its dependencies.
But they never defined what a dependency was.
Exactly. Those treaties never explicitly cataloged the dependencies. So the French established customized regional courts known as the Chambers of Reunion in newly acquired cities like Metz and Besançon.
And these courts are entirely staffed by French judges, right?
Yes, exclusively French judges, interpreting medieval charters and feudal records on behalf of the French king.
So they were essentially looking for any excuse.
The judges combed through centuries-old documents to find any instance where a neighboring village, a toll bridge, or a patch of forest had ever paid feudal homage to the territory France now owned.
Even if it was hundreds of years ago.
Even if it was incredibly tenuous. If they found a link, the Chamber of Reunion would legally declare that specific piece of land a dependency and award it to France.
For those of you listening, trying to wrap your head around this, think of it like a homeowner trying to build a new security fence.
That is a good way to look at it.
The neighborhood property lines are vague. Instead of negotiating with the neighbors, the homeowner sets up a courtroom in his own kitchen, appoints himself the judge, and starts reviewing neighborhood association notes from 3 decades ago.
Right, and he formally rules that the neighbor's driveway, their prize-winning rose bush, and a chunk of their patio are historical dependencies of his house.
And once the ruling is made, he immediately paves over the roses and builds a concrete guard tower.
It is a stunning blend of strict legal adherence and tonal aggression. Whenever the chamber awarded a territory, French cavalry would ride in, take physical possession, and Vauban's engineers would immediately begin fortifying it.
Just annexing vast tracts of land.
Yeah, including the county of Montbéliard and large portions of the Spanish Duchy of Luxembourg. And it culminated in September 1681 with the seizure of Strasbourg.
Now, Strasbourg is critical.
It was a free imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire, and it controlled a vital bridge over the Rhine River.
And the French troops simply march in unprovoked.
They surround the city and force its surrender, and on the very same day, French forces marched into Casale in northern Italy.
Which was a fortress they had covertly purchased to intimidate the Duke of Savoy and threaten Spanish Milan.
So the paradox of Louis's strategy is laid bare right here. He claimed he was merely securing his borders, building walls to protect his people, but to his neighbors, this did not look like defense.
It looked like an unstoppable, creeping universal monarchy.
Right. The fortresses Vauban built were indeed defensive, but they also functioned as forward operating bases. They projected French military threat deep into the German states and the Spanish Netherlands.
So the homeowner is stealing everyone's lawn, building towers, and no one is calling the authorities. The obvious question you have to ask is, why does the Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, let Louis get away with this?
Well, the answer lies hundreds of miles to the east, in a completely different crisis.
Right.
Emperor Leopold was the primary rival to French hegemony on the continent, but his attention and his military resources were entirely consumed by the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottomans are executing a thrust into Central Europe.
A very severe one. It culminated in the Siege of Vienna in the summer of 1683. The survival of the Holy Roman Empire was genuinely hanging in the balance. Leopold sent out desperate appeals to the Christian monarchs of Europe for assistance.
And Louis XIV, who fashions himself the most Christian king, receives this plea for help against the Ottomans. How does he respond?
He just ignores it.
Wow, wait, he actually encourages it, right?
He does. In fact, French diplomats in Constantinople had actively encouraged the Ottoman offensive. Louis knew that an existential threat to Vienna would paralyze Leopold, giving France a completely free hand in the West.
So, while the combined armies of the Emperor and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth are fighting for their lives outside the walls of Vienna, Louis launches an invasion of the Spanish Netherlands to secure the rest of Luxembourg.
Exactly. Spain is so outraged that they declare war on France, expecting Leopold to make a quick peace in the east and come to their aid.
But Leopold chooses to press his advantage against the retreating Ottomans.
Leaving Spain to face France completely alone, Spain was swiftly defeated, resulting in the Truce of Ratisbon in August 1684.
And this truce allowed France to retain all of its reunion gains, including Strasbourg and Luxembourg, for 20 years.
From a purely cynical strategic viewpoint, Louis played the situation perfectly.
He achieved his secure borders, he neutralized the emperor. But then, in October 1685, Louis makes a domestic policy decision that fundamentally destroys his diplomatic standing.
He signs the Edict of Fontainebleau, which revokes the Edict of Nantes.
And this hands his enemies the ultimate weapon against him. Let us talk about the Huguenots.
The original Edict of Nantes, issued in 1598, had ended the French wars of religion by granting substantial civil and religious rights to the Huguenots, who were France's Protestant minority.
So for nearly a century, they had lived, worked, and worshipped in France.
But Louis XIV, embracing the absolute ideology of one king, one law, one faith, decided to eradicate Protestantism within his borders.
The revocation outlawed Protestant worship entirely.
It ordered the destruction of their churches and mandated the Catholic baptism of their children.
And to enforce this, the state deployed the Dragonnades.
Right. Quartering rough, undisciplined dragoons in the homes of Huguenot families. The goal was to financially ruin them and terrorize them into converting.
And the human toll is just staggering. Around 200,000 Huguenots flew the country.
They fled across the borders, seeking refuge in Protestant nations like the Dutch Republic, England, Switzerland, and various German states. And the demographic and economic loss to France was immense.
Because the Huguenots were deeply integrated into the merchant class, the artisan guilds, and the banking sector.
Absolutely. For example, silk weavers from cities like Tours and Lyon fled to London, establishing the prosperous Spitalfields silk industry.
We often focus on the economic brain drain, But as sources point out, the geopolitical fallout is what directly fuels the 9 Years' War.
Right, because these refugees do not just leave quietly, they bring their stories with them.
They bring horrifying accounts of state-sponsored terror.
In the Dutch Republic, the city of Amsterdam, which was dominated by wealthy merchants, had traditionally favored a policy of appeasing France to maintain lucrative trade relations.
Keep the money flowing.
Exactly. But the influx of traumatized Huguenots, coupled with French tariffs designed to harm Dutch shipping, completely flipped public opinion.
The propaganda, printed by Huguenot exiles in Amsterdam, painted Louis XIV as a bloodthirsty tyrant.
And this shift in public sentiment handed the political initiative to William of Orange, the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, who had dedicated his life to forging a European coalition against France.
It also completely alienates France's few remaining allies in Germany.
Right. Frederick William, the Elector of Brandenburg, had a treaty with Louis. But when the Huguenots are expelled, the Elector responds by issuing the Edict of Potsdam, offering the refugees safe haven, tax exemptions, and subsidies to settle in his lands.
He abandons his alliance with France and begins coordinating with William of Orange.
This is the critical juncture where Louis's domestic policy completely undermined his foreign policy. He had spent years building physical fortresses, but his religious persecution provided his enemies with a profound moral and ideological justification to unite against him.
Wait, let us examine Louis's mindset here, because I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
Yeah.
If you are trying to secure your borders because you fear encirclement, why would you deliberately provoke every Protestant state on the continent?
It is a vital distinction to make.
Was he operating out of sheer arrogance, believing no one could touch him? Or was he genuinely terrified of internal dissent weakening the state?
To a modern observer, the revocation looks like pure hubris. But in the context of 17th century absolutism, internal religious division was viewed as an existential security threat.
Like a constant invitation for foreign powers to fund civil war.
Exactly.
Right.
Louis believed that forcing religious unity would make France impregnable from within, just as Vauban's fortresses made it impregnable from without.
He just severely miscalculated the external reaction.
He assumed the Truce of Ratisbon and the Ottoman distraction provided a permanent shield.
So he practically drafts the recruitment pamphlets for the armies that will soon march against him. And then in July 1686, the League of Augsburg is formed.
It is a defensive pact aimed explicitly at halting French expansion.
The signatories include Emperor Leopold, the kings of Spain and Sweden, and key German princes.
Even Pope Innocent XI provides quiet support. He was furious with Louis over his religious arrogance and his refusal to fight the Ottomans.
So Europe is polarized and armed. The underlying tensions merely required a spark to ignite a general war.
And that spark arrived 2 years later, in 1688, over a seemingly arcane issue, the election of the Archbishop Elector of Cologne.
A clerical election sounds like an administrative footnote to us today, but you really have to look at the map.
Right, the Archbishop of Cologne is not just a religious figure, he is a territorial prince.
His lands sit squarely on the left bank of the Rhine River, encompassing vital fortresses and supply routes.
If you control Cologne, you control the highway into the Spanish Netherlands and the Dutch Republic.
So when the pro-French archbishop died in June 1688, Louis XIV aggressively backed his own candidate, Wilhelm Egon von Fürstenberg, to secure that highway.
And Emperor Leopold backed a rival, Joseph Clement of Bavaria. The election within the cathedral chapter was contested and ultimately fell to the Pope to decide.
And given his poor relations with Louis, Pope Innocent XI ruled in favor of the emperor's candidate.
Louis loses the Bucker Zone. And right at this very moment, in September 1688, news reaches Versailles that Emperor Leopold's forces have captured the fortress of Belgrade from the Ottoman Empire.
The Turkish threat in the east is collapsing much faster than anyone anticipated.
The capture of Belgrade changed the strategic calculus overnight. The French foreign minister, Colbert de Croissy, and the war minister, Louvois, recognized that Emperor Leopold would soon be free to march his highly experienced victorious army back west to the Rhine.
To settle the score over the territories France had annexed during the War of the Reunions.
Exactly. So the French high command decides they cannot wait for the hammer to fall. They opt for a preemptive strike.
The goal is to cross the Rhine, capture key fortresses, and intimidate the German princes into converting the 20-year Truce of Ratisbon into a permanent peace treaty before Leopold's army can arrive.
In late September 1688, French forces crossed the Rhine and laid siege to the fortress of Philipsburg.
But the operation did not yield the swift, bloodless capitulation they had planned, did it?
No, not at all. The siege dragged on for a month. The French army found itself overextended, and intelligence indicated that the German states were mobilizing rapidly.
So, realizing they cannot garrison all the territory they have marched into, the French resort to one of the most brutal tactics of the era.
A systematic scorched earth campaign across the Palatinate, Baden, and Württemberg
Louvois ordered the deliberate destruction of the region.
to deny the advancing German and imperial armies any resources. The logic was entirely military. If the land is a wasteland, an enemy army cannot forage to feed its horses or troops, and therefore cannot use it as a staging ground to invade France.
But the execution was just merciless.
French troops spent the winter and spring of 1689 burning over 20 substantial towns to the ground.
They ordered the inhabitants of cities like Mannheim and Worms out into the winter cold, then set fire to the building.
They even packed the magnificent Heidelberg Castle, a jewel of the German Renaissance, with gunpowder and blew it apart.
So the intention was to create a defensive barrier of ash and rubble, and simultaneously to terrify the German princes into submission.
But as you might expect, military intimidation often yields the exact opposite of its intended psychological effect.
Instead of terrifying them, it absolutely enrages them.
Any hesitation among the German princes regarding whether they should join the fight just evaporates. In February 1689, the Imperial Diet formally declares war on France.
And by the summer, the German estates have fielded 3 large armies along the Rhine and begin recapturing fortresses like Mainz and Bonn.
The French preemptive strike is a total strategic failure. It forged the very coalition it was meant to prevent.
And while the bulk of the French army was committed to the siege of Philipsburg and the destruction of the Palatinate, Louis XIV's greatest adversary saw a window of unprecedented opportunity.
William of Orange.
Right. Watching the French march deep into Germany, he realized his borders were temporarily safe from French invasion.
So he initiated one of the most audacious maritime operations in European history, the invasion of England, which the English term the Glorious Revolution.
Let us examine the logistics of what William of Orange achieved in November 1688, because the sources paint a staggering picture.
We often picture a few ships slipping across the English Channel, a bloodless political handover, but this was an armada.
The invasion fleet consisted of 463 ships. It carried 40,000 men and 5,000 horses.
To contextualize that, William's fleet was roughly twice the size of the famed Spanish Armada of 1588.
And the logistical complexity of transporting 5,000 horses across the notoriously unpredictable autumn waters of the North Sea is immense.
Horses require vast amounts of fresh water and specialized slings to keep them from breaking their legs in rough weather. It was an enormous roll of the dice. If a severe storm had caught the fleet, the Dutch military would have been wiped out.
Now, I have to push back on Louis XIV's decision-making here.
Okay.
Louis had the finest intelligence network in Europe. He knew William was assembling this colossal fleet in the Dutch ports. If William sails for England, the Dutch Republic is left practically defenseless.
That is true.
So why does Louis not just immediately pivot his armies, threaten the Dutch border, and force William to cancel the invasion? It seems like a glaring catastrophic blunder.
It really does appear that way in hindsight. However, we must consider Louis's assumptions at that precise moment. Louis actively wanted William to invade England.
Wait, he wanted him to invade?
The French assessment was that King James II of England, who was a Catholic sympathetic to France, had a strong enough army and enough loyalists to drag William into a protracted, exhausting civil war.
Ah, I see. Louis assumes England will become a quagmire for the Dutch.
Precisely. Louis believed that an English civil war would consume the military and financial resources of both the Dutch Republic and England, keeping both maritime powers completely sidelined, while France dealt with the German states on the continent.
But the reality on the ground in England proves Louis completely wrong.
William lands at Torbay. King James II's support crumbles almost instantly. His army refuses to fight, and his leading commanders defect to William.
James flees to France in December.
William and his wife Mary, who is James's Protestant daughter, are crowned joint monarchs.
And William's primary objective in taking the English crown was not a magnanimous desire to protect English constitutional liberties.
No, it was an outright military coup designed to harness the financial power and the naval strength of England and yoke it directly to the Grand Alliance against France.
And the English Parliament quickly discovers what they have signed up for. William does not just sit on the throne, He completely restructures the English military to fight a continental war.
William brought in veteran Dutch commanders to lead the English forces. He introduced the Dutch exercise into the English infantry.
What exactly did that entail?
Well, before this, infantry lines often fired massive simultaneous volleys, leaving the entire line defenseless and unloaded while they frantically reloaded their weapons.
So you fire, and then you are just standing there holding an empty pipe where the enemy cavalry charges.
Exactly. The Dutch exercise utilized platoon fire. The infantry line was divided into smaller sections, or platoons. These platoons would fire in a carefully choreographed rolling sequence.
Platoon A fires, then Platoon B, then Platoon C.
Yes. By the time the last platoon fired, the first had finished reloading. It created a continuous, unending wall of lead. William transformed the English army from a domestic security force into a modern, disciplined machine capable of standing against the French regulars.
So by the spring of 1689, the geopolitical landscape has completely transformed against Louis.
The Grand Alliance is formalized. The Dutch Republic, England, the Holy Roman Emperor, Spain, and eventually the Duke of Savoy form a united front.
Their stated unified goal is to force France to abandon all the territories it gained through the reunions and return to the borders established in 1659.
Louis had fundamentally miscalculated, but he possessed one remaining card regarding England.
James II was in exile at the French court.
If William of Orange refused to get bogged down in an English civil war, Louis decided he would force William to fight a civil war in his own backyard.
This decision spread the conflict to the Celtic fringe of the British Isles.
In March 1689, James II lands at Kinsale in Ireland. And he does not arrive alone. He brings 6,000 French regular troops, supplied and funded by Louis.
Because Ireland possessed a Catholic majority that viewed the deposed James as their legitimate king.
The Lord Deputy of Ireland, the Earl of Tyrconnell, had spent the previous years securing the Irish army with Catholic officers loyal to James. When James landed, a large Jacobite army mobilized.
Simultaneously, uprisings broke out in the Scottish Highlands, led by John Graham, Viscount Dundee.
But as the war in Ireland, the Williamite War, escalates, there is a severe disconnect between what James wants and what his patron, Louis, actually wants.
They are fighting the same war for entirely different reasons.
James II viewed Ireland merely as a stepping stone. His single obsession was to use the Irish army to cross the Irish Sea, land in Scotland or England, and march on London to reclaim his throne.
Whereas Louis XIV viewed the Irish theater as a strategic dead end.
He had no intention of committing the immense resources required to actually restore James to power. Louis's goal was a proxy war.
He wanted to tie down William's troops, forcing the English to bleed money and manpower in the bogs of Ireland, preventing them from deploying to the Spanish Netherlands.
And it creates intense, localized violence. We see the horrific siege of Derry in 1689, where Protestant forces hold out behind city walls, facing starvation, while a physical boom across the river blocks supply ships.
But the localized conflict demands William's direct attention. In July 1690, William of Orange himself travels to Ireland.
This leads to the Battle of the Boyne. William, commanding a multinational force of English, Dutch, Danish, and Huguenot troops, forces a crossing of the River Boyne against the Jacobite army.
It was a decisive psychological and tactical victory for William.
James II, witnessing the defeat, fled the battlefield and immediately took a ship back to France. His departure shattered the morale of the Irish army, who felt abandoned.
The war in Ireland continues for another brutal year, culminating in the Battle of Aughrim in July 1691.
It remains the bloodiest battle ever fought on Irish soil. The Franco-Irish army is decimated by William's Dutch commander Godert de Ginkle. The Jacobites surrender at Limerick, ending the war in Ireland.
The Scottish risings are similarly suppressed after the Jacobites lose their commander at the Battle of Killiecrankie.
So we must evaluate Louis's strategy of diversion. In the short term, it was highly effective. For the critical campaign seasons of 1689 and 1690, William's primary forces were bogged down in Ireland.
This allowed brilliant French commanders on the continent, like Marshal Luxembourg, to score significant victories at battles like Fleurus.
But the long-term cost of that diversion is catastrophic for France.
By backing James II with French golden troops, Louis proves to the English Parliament that France is an existential threat to their Protestant settlement.
Precisely. Louis inadvertently handed William the perfect political leverage. The English Parliament, which was traditionally highly suspicious of maintaining large standing armies or funding foreign wars, willingly opened the treasury.
Once the British Isles were secured by late 1691, the full, immense economic and military weight of the Anglo-Dutch alliance crossed the Channel and arrived in the Spanish Netherlands.
And when that weight arrives, the conflict transforms into something unrecognizable. We enter the phase of the war that can only be described as a meat grinder.
The fighting stalemates into grueling positional warfare along the Rhine, in northern Italy, and primarily in the Spanish Netherlands, which is modern-day Belgium.
If you are envisioning the fluid, rapid cavalry maneuvers of the Napoleonic era, you must discard that image. The warfare of the late 17th century was painfully slow, governed entirely by the constraints of logistics.
Let us unpack the mechanics of this, because it is crucial to understanding the sources. By the mid-1690s, the armies of France and the Grand Alliance had swelled to unprecedented sizes.
A single field army could number 100,000 men.
Moving and feeding an entity of that size is akin to migrating a major city every few weeks.
An army of 100,000 men required thousands of tons of bread, fodder for the tens of thousands of horses, and vast amounts of powder.
You could not move far from navigable river systems.
Because horse-drawn wagons simply could not carry enough supplies over the muddy, unpaved roads of the era, the horses would eat all the grain in the wagons before they ever reached their destination.
So it is less like a strategic chess match and more like trying to march a hungry city across the countryside.
The only way to feed your soldiers is by controlling the territory to extract contributions, essentially robbing the local population of their harvest and wealth.
But to control the territory, you have to capture the fortresses. If the enemy holds the fortress, they control the local supply lines, and your moving city starves.
This logistical reality meant that generals rarely sought out decisive field battles. The English writer Daniel Defoe noted in 1697 that armies of 50,000 men would spend an entire summer dodging one another, maneuvering for foraging rights before retreating into winter quarters.
The real war was fought in the trenches around the star fortresses.
And this brings us back to Vauban and his Dutch counterpart, Menno van Coehoorn. These two military engineers turned siege warfare into a deadly mathematical science.
The Spanish Netherlands was the most heavily fortified region on Earth. We see the rivalry between Vauban and Coehoorn Peak at the fortress of Namur, a massive citadel sitting at the junction of two vital rivers.
In 1692, the French army, with Louis XIV personally observing, laid siege to Namur. Coehoorn was actually commanding the defense of the innermost citadel. Despite a brilliant defense, Vauban's meticulous system of siegecraft prevailed.
Explain how that mathematical siegecraft works. They do not just charge the walls, do they?
Charging a star fortress was suicide. The angled bastions ensured there were no blind spots. Attackers would be caught in brutal, overlapping crossfire.
So what is the alternative?
Instead, Vauban perfected the system of parallels. The attacking engineers would dig a trench exactly parallel to the fortress walls, out of range of the defenders' cannons.
Then they would dig zigzagging trenches, called saps, forward toward the fortress.
The zigzag pattern prevented the defenders from firing straight down the trench. Once close enough, they dug a second parallel, brought up heavy artillery, and battered the walls from point-blank range until a breach was formed.
And 3 years after Vauban takes Namur, the roles reverse. In 1695, William of Orange and Coehoorn return and besiege Namur, which is now defended by the French.
After a horrific, casualty-heavy siege, the Allies recapture it. It proves that the French war machine is not invincible, but the human cost of these operations is staggering.
The armies bled each other dry over these walls, but the civilian population suffered far worse.
The endless requisitioning of grain to feed the armies meant there were no reserves. When severe weather caused consecutive harvest failures in 1693 and 1694, a catastrophic famine struck France and northern Italy.
The statistics from the sources are horrifying. People were eating grass and roots.
It is estimated that the famine and the diseases that followed malnutrition killed around 2 million people in France alone. Roughly 10% of the French population perished.
The financial systems of Europe were simultaneously imploding. Louis XIV's decision to melt down his silver furniture was an act of sheer desperation.
To continue funding the war, the French state introduced the capitation, a radical new direct tax that theoretically applied to everyone, even the nobility.
Across the Channel, the English established the Bank of England in 1694, specifically to manage the colossal debt required to keep their armies in the field.
Because the land war in Europe is a deadlocked, bankrupting nightmare, Both sides look for ways to hurt the enemy that do not involve feeding 100,000 men in the mud.
And this causes the conflict to spill outward, onto the oceans and into the colonies. The 9 Years' War becomes a truly global theater.
In North America, the conflict is known as King William's War. Tensions between French and English colonists were already at the breaking point over control of the lucrative fur trade and influence over the powerful Iroquois Confederacy.
When news of the European War arrived, it provided the spark.
The French Governor-General of New France, the Count of Frontenac, knows he cannot fight a conventional war against the more populous English colonies.
So he utilizes French regular troops alongside indigenous allies to launch brutal, deep penetration raids during the winter.
They use snowshoes to cross the frozen wilderness, attacking frontier settlements in New York and New England, burning villages like Schenectady and Salmon Falls.
The English colonists retaliate by organizing an amphibious assault. Sir William Phips leads a naval expedition from Massachusetts to attack the heart of New France at Quebec in 1690.
However, poor coordination and Frontenac's strong defenses force Phips to retreat in failure.
But the truly decisive shift away from Europe happens at sea. Early in the war, the French Navy tries to fight traditional fleet battles.
In 1692, at the battles of Barfleur and La Hogue, the combined Anglo-Dutch fleet intercepts and destroys a major French fleet that was preparing to escort a second invasion force to England.
After La Hogue, the French realize they simply cannot afford to rebuild vast ships of the line to contest naval supremacy.
And here we see the versatility of the French engineer, Vauban. He drafts a memorandum advocating for a total shift in naval doctrine.
He proposes abandoning guerre d'escadre, which is the strategy of fielding grand battle fleets.
Instead, he argues for guerre de course, a war of commerce raiding.
Let us examine the mechanics of how this privateering system works, because it is essentially state-sponsored piracy.
The French crown could not afford to pay its sailors or maintain its ships, so the state leased its naval warships to private syndicates of merchants and captains.
These privateers were granted royal commissions to hunt down and capture Allied merchant vessels.
The captured ships and cargo were sold, and the profits were split between the crew, the syndicate investors, and the king.
It was a brilliant asymmetric strategy. It starved the Dutch and English economies of the trade income they relied on to fund their land armies, and it did so without draining the French treasury.
And it is incredibly effective. French privateers like Jean Bart become legendary figures. Bart specialized in slipping his nimble frigates past the Allied blockade of Dunkirk.
In 1696, he intercepts a Dutch merchant convoy in the North Sea and burns 45 of their ships.
The reach of these privateers was global. In 1697, a French squadron under the Baron of Pointes sailed across the Atlantic, attacked the heavily fortified Spanish port of Cartagena in modern-day Colombia, and returned to France with millions of livres in looted silver.
We also see clashes in Asia, where the Dutch capture the French commercial outpost of Pondicherry in India.
It perfectly illustrates how interconnected the world has become. A treaty signed in a palace in Europe suddenly dictates the survival of an Iroquois village in upstate New York, or the fate of a merchant convoy sailing past the coast of India.
By 1696, the economic strangulation of the privateers was severely hurting the Allies. But the sheer cost of maintaining the land armies, coupled with the lingering effects of the famine, had entirely exhausted France.
Every belligerent power was financially broken and desperate for an exit. The war had ground to a halt, not through military victory, but through mutual exhaustion.
The Grand Alliance begins to fracture, and the first crack appears in Italy. The Duke of Savoy, Victor Amadeus, looks at the geopolitical board.
He realizes that his allies, the Holy Roman Emperor and Spain, are stationed in his territory and are beginning to pose a greater threat to his sovereignty than the French.
The Duke executed a masterclass in diplomatic leverage. Recognizing his crucial geographic position guarding the Alpine passes into Italy, he secretly opened negotiations with French diplomats.
In the summer of 1696, they signed the Treaty of Turin. France agreed to return the highly strategic fortresses of Pinerolo and Casale to Savoy, neutralizing the threat to the Duke's capital.
In exchange, Savoy abandoned the Grand Alliance, declared neutrality, and forced the Imperial and Spanish troops out of his territory.
Once Savoy drops out, the dominoes fall. The Allies realize their coalition is unraveling. Everyone agrees to send diplomats to a palace in Ryswick, near The Hague, in the spring of 1697 to negotiate an end to the bloodshed.
The Treaty of Ryswick, signed in September 1697, reflects the exhausted stalemate. The terms essentially required everyone to return the territories they had conquered during the war, restoring the borders to roughly where they were in 1679.
Louis XIV returned the Duchy of Lorraine. He dismantled the fortresses he had built on the right bank of the Rhine and withdrew from Luxembourg.
However, Louis is allowed to keep the crown jewel of his annexations, the entirety of Alsace, including the vital city of Strasbourg.
But he has to make an enormous political concession to William of Orange.
Louis was forced to formally recognize William III as the legitimate rightful king of England, Scotland, and Ireland.
Furthermore, Louis promised to withdraw all military and financial support from the exiled James II. For William, this was the ultimate victory. He had secured his throne and brought England permanently into the anti-French orbit.
But when you look at the Treaty of Ryswick, you have to ask, was this a genuine peace treaty? Or was it just a desperate ceasefire to allow everyone to restock their ammunition?
It was undeniably a truce of exhaustion, because they spend months haggling over the borders of the Rhine while completely ignoring the unavoidable crisis looming over Europe.
Throughout the entire 9 years of warfare, the King of Spain, Charles II, had been severely ill. He had no children, and it was clear he was nearing death.
The Spanish Empire was the largest in the world, encompassing territories in the Low Countries, Italy, the Americas, and the Philippines. Everyone at Ryswick knew that the moment Charles died, the Austrian Habsburgs and the French Bourbons would both claim the entire empire.
They signed the treaty at Ryswick not to achieve permanent peace, but to secure their immediate borders and rebuild their shattered economies so they could fight the real decisive war over the Spanish succession.
Before we conclude, we must look at how the actual mechanics of combat evolved during this agonizing 9-year struggle. The 1690s witnessed technological leaps that permanently changed how armies fought.
We discussed the Dutch exercise and platoon fire, but the weapons themselves underwent a revolution.
The most critical transition was the replacement of the matchlock musket with the flintlock musket. The matchlock was a terrifyingly unreliable weapon. To fire it, a soldier had to keep a literal piece of burning rope, a slow match, continuously smoldering.
During the chaos of battle, bringing a glowing ember close to loose gunpowder was highly dangerous.
If it rained, the matches went out and the entire infantry line was rendered useless. Furthermore, the glow of the matches made night operations almost impossible.
The flintlock solves all of this. It utilizes a mechanism where a piece of flint strikes a steel frizzen, creating a shower of sparks directly into the priming pan.
It is faster to reload, it functions in damp weather, and it does not require an open flame.
And coupled with the flintlock was an even more profound innovation, the socket bayonet. Prior to this, armies had to deploy a mixture of musketeers to shoot the enemy, and pikemen soldiers wielding 16-foot spears to defend the musketeers from cavalry charges while they reloaded.
They did attempt to combine the roles with the plug bayonet, which was essentially a long dagger with a tapered handle. But the mechanics of the plug bayonet are fundamentally flawed.
Because the handle of the plug bayonet was jammed directly inside the barrel of the musket. Once the bayonet was inserted, the gun could no longer be fired. The soldier was reduced to wielding a short, awkward pike.
The socket bayonet resolved this brilliantly. It featured a metal sleeve or socket that slid over the outside of the muzzle and locked into place, using a lug soldered onto the barrel.
It is a complete paradigm shift. The blade sits off to the side, meaning the infantryman can load, fire, and reload his weapon with the bayonet fully attached. Every single soldier on the battlefield is now simultaneously a musketeer and a pikeman.
The French army recognized the devastating efficiency of this combination when Allied infantry successfully repulsed French cavalry charges using only flintlocks and socket bayonets. By the end of the 9 Years' War, the traditional pikeman, a staple of European warfare for centuries, was entirely obsolete.
We also see major mechanical innovations at sea. As the maritime powers struggled to control the oceans, handling large warships became critical. During this decade, the English Navy introduced the ship's wheel.
Prior to the wheel, ships were steered using a whipstaff. The whipstaff was a long vertical lever attached directly to the tiller below decks. The helmsman had to physically push this lever back and forth.
In heavy weather, the force of the rudder against the water was so immense that it required multiple men to move the lever, and it offered very limited maneuverability.
The ship's wheel changes the physics. By connecting a wheel to a system of ropes and pulleys, the helmsman gains mechanical advantage. It allows for far more precise, rapid steering during the chaotic maneuvering of a naval battle.
Fascinatingly, the French Navy, despite Vauban's engineering brilliance on land, resisted adopting the ship's wheel for another 30 years.
It demonstrates how the sheer, crushing scale of this conflict forced innovation across every conceivable domain, from the mathematical geometry of a star fortress and the metallurgical design of a bayonet lug, to the creation of national banks required to fund armies of 100,000 men.
And as we look at the legacy of the 9 Years' War, it proved one vital strategic truth. No single nation, not even the absolute power of Louis XIV at the absolute zenith of his wealth and military capability, could dominate Europe if the other powers united against him.
The Grand Alliance successfully contained the creeping expansionism of the Sun King through sheer collective weight and economic endurance.
Yet the tragedy of the war is that the very coalition that stopped Louis XIV was built on a fragile, temporary alignment of fears. The underlying dynastic tensions that drove the conflict were left completely unresolved by the Treaty of Ryswick.
Because as the diplomats packed up their papers and the armies marched back to their winter quarters, every monarch in Europe was already looking south toward Madrid, waiting for King Charles II to die.
Knowing with absolute certainty that the bloodiest conflict was yet to come.
The 9 Years' War was the training ground. It built the armies, forged the alliances, and refined the deadly technologies that would shortly be unleashed upon the world again.
So as you look at the map of Europe today, consider how much of it was drawn not by peaceful diplomacy, but by the desperate need to build walls and the terrifying cost of trying to break them down.
That is a thought worth exploring on your own.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.